Welcome back, everyone, to your favorite niche history podcast about jewelry. It's Ancient History Jewelry Stories. As always, I am your intrepid host, Melise, a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques with a healthy, maybe unhealthy, obsession with ancient history. We are here with episode 2 of this month's topic, the greatest jewelry scandals in history. On the last episode, we covered the one and only time the British royal jewels were rather ineptly stolen, the whereabouts of the missing French blue diamond, as well as what happened to the cut parts of the original stone, and the audacious Great Diamond hoax of 1872. You don't need to have listened to part 1 in order to enjoy part 2, but I don't see why you wouldn't, as it's full of ridiculous stories of jewelry theft. This episode is going to be a long one. We have quite a bit of scandalous ground to cover. This episode will end with the much-awaited story of Marie Antoinette and the affair of the diamond necklace. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the famed missing amber room, as well as how Napoleon Bonaparte's sad boy antics led to the creation of the modern police force and criminology in France. I absolutely adore every opportunity to talk about Napoleon because learning about him is really like the scene in The Wizard of Oz where they pull back the curtain and reveal that the wizard is just some dude from Omaha. So, where do we begin this second chapter of jewelry scandals? Let's start in very early 18th century Prussia, in what is now Germany, specifically a little town called Berlin. From 1701 till at least 1707, a group of talented artisans and craftspeople toiled away to create what was once known as the eighth wonder of the world, the famed missing amber room. Exactly as it sounds, it was a room paneled in beautiful, intricate, carved amber, backed with mirrors and gold leaf for maximum insanity. When I posted a video about this room last week, I had a few people comment that they thought it was absolutely hideous, too flashy. Listen, folks, monarchs are not known for their subtlety, and the Baroque era in Prussia was especially ridiculous. Originally intended for the insanely sumptuous and beautiful Charlottenburg Palace, the room was instead installed in the Berlin City Palace, a decidedly more stoic building that didn't seem to have the trappings of an elaborate wedding cake. The interiors seemed to have been far more foreboding and heavy, giving the Amber Room an entirely different vibe than it would have had in the pastel Charlottenburg Palace. The room itself was a masterwork of Baroque collaboration. The original design was conceptualized by the sculptor Andreas Schlüter and constructed by master Danish amber craftsman Gottfried Wolfram. What palace it was installed in and the subsequent vibes didn't matter for too long because in 1716, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia was visiting and absolutely fell in love with the Amber Room, which prompted the Prussian King Frederick William I to give it to him as a gift, as a sign of trust and allyship. Peter had it installed in the Winter House in St. Petersburg, but in 1755 it was moved to its most famous home, Catherine Palace. A palace that is essentially the exact image my brain pulls up when you ask me what a palace looks like. Seriously, go look it up. It's the sort of thing that only exists in fairy tales about secret princesses. It's exactly the sort of crazy place that needed a sparkling, golden, amber-encrusted chamber, and it fit the palace so well that after multiple additions and renovations, the room eventually covered over 590 square feet, or 55 square meters. By the time it was quote-unquote completed, it contained over 6 tons of amber. It's estimated that, at this point, the room would have been worth around $215 million in today's money. Tsarina Elizabeth, the woman who had the chamber moved to the Catherine Palace, used it as a meditation chamber, which is a fucking rad use of the room, if I do say so myself. It was also used as a gathering room by Catherine the Great, which is not the slightest bit shocking given her taste for nothing but the fanciest jewels. I can just imagine her wearing a big silk gown and her trademark bow choker, made entirely out of diamonds, just glowing in the warm dark of the room. Okay, cool. An elaborately carved amber and gold chamber in a fairy tale palace, gleaming in candlelight. Something truly valuable, but equally difficult to steal. Or so you would think. An entire room seems like a preposterous thing for a thief to make away with, but the Nazis were absolutely preposterous, and this kind of culturally significant masterpiece of European art was exactly the kind of thing that Hitler got all hot and bothered about. Operating under the assertion that the room was made by Germans for Germans, the Amber Room was now in his sights as a prime target for looting during Operation Barbarossa, the 1941 invasion of Russia by Nazi forces. Knowing that the room was in danger, curators of the Catherine Palace attempted to dismantle and hide the panels. Once the old and dried-out amber began crumbling, they instead opted to hide the panels behind wallpaper. Of course, a room famous enough to be dubbed the eighth wonder of the world is a very difficult thing to hide, and the ruse did not fool the Nazis, who dismantled the room and packed it into crates within 36 hours. After being shipped back to Germany, the room was reassembled inside the Königsberg Castle in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in modern Russia. Out of all of the castles we've talked about so far, this is the only one that is not standing today, which is a bit problematic because we know it contained the Amber Room. Knowing the war was about to end, and not in Germany's favor, officials at the Königsberg Castle once again dismantled and crated up the panels, storing them in the castle's basement. In 1944, the castle was bombed essentially into oblivion, leaving just a small amount of ruins. And that's where we lose all track of the Amber Room. But wait, I've seen the Amber Room, you say. Well, either you are in your 80s or 90s and have a very sharp memory of your childhood, in which case, please, please, please write me and tell me all about the original Amber Room, or you've seen the replica, which was completed in 2003 after being under construction since 1979. The replica is a beautiful work of art in and of itself, but a lot of guesswork went into completing it. There are photos of the room before it was stolen by the Nazis, sure, but many details were essentially left up to the imagination of the modern craftspeople who worked on it. There are photos from the reconstruction of artisans having to compare their work to blurry black and white photos of the original room, which seems like a stressful way to create a replica. You have to have sharp eyes to make out details in black and white photos of a medium that relies very much on the difference in colors to create design. The striking array of gold, yellow, orange, brown, and red tones found in amber are absent in black and white photos. Whatever the case, the replica is a beautiful work of art, though I cannot say if it's as magnificent as the original. So, what exactly happened to the panels of the Amber Room between being stored in the castle's basement and the castle being completely leveled? There are plenty of theories, ranging from believable but pessimistic to wild conjecture. Plenty of historians and art experts agree that the panels were destroyed during the bombing of the castle. After all, they had to have been pretty fragile by now, and likely quite damaged. If they were already dry and crumbling before the Nazis got to them, I can't imagine that it helped any to reconstruct and then dismantle the panels again. There are also photos of the room in the Catherine Palace after the looting. It's clear that the Nazis didn't take much care when ripping the panels out of the walls. There's a lot of very obvious damage to the walls that suggests the panels were taken rather forcefully. And I'd imagine plenty of carved components were also damaged in the process. Amber is quite soft. It is, after all, fossilized tree resin. At least 2 pieces from the Amber Room have been found and returned to Russia, though they aren't exactly the pieces people have been looking for. A marble mosaic and a small cabinet, both known to have been a part of the room in Catherine Palace, were returned to Russia in 2000. The mosaic is one of a set of 4, known as Feel and Touch, and both pieces were in the possession of the family of a German soldier who claimed to have been a part of the operation to pack up and transport the Amber Room. This refers to the first time when it was removed from the Catherine Palace, or the second time when it was brought down to the castle's basement in Königsberg. Reportedly, the remains of the other 3 mosaics in this set had been found, burnt, in the basement after the bombing. This was reported before the existence of the 4th mosaic in the hands of a German soldier was known. It's further cemented the theory that the remains of the room were destroyed. So, that's the perfectly reasonable but very pessimistic theory. What are the other ones? There's the transport ship theory. Eyewitness accounts describe the crates containing the amber panels being loaded onto the ship SS Wilhelm Gustloff, which was immediately sunk by a Soviet submarine. Despite many dives over the ensuing decades, nothing related to the Amber Room has turned up at the wreck site. Similar theories include the panels being hidden in salt mines on the Czech border, being sunk in a lagoon in Lithuania, and even being shipped off to the US. But my favorite theory, the one that really takes the cake in its tinfoil hat weirdness and actually does absolutely nothing to answer the question of where the Amber Room is the theory that Stalin had a copy of the Amber Room made to protect it from exactly this sort of thing, and the Nazis actually stole a fake version of the room. Which, cool theory, but now we have 2 missing Amber Rooms to look for, and that complicates things instead of solving them. Like so many historical capers, the real scandal is a little harder to pick out. It isn't the Nazi looting, and it isn't the mystery of where the room went. It's the fact that it's almost certainly been destroyed, but that the search was kept up for the better part of the 20th century as a smokescreen by the Russians, specifically the KGB, to deflect from the fact that they had likely been the ones to unintentionally destroy their beloved Amber Room when they bombed Königsberg. In fact, they went so far as to have whatever remained of the room's last known whereabouts, that is, the bombed-out remains of Königsberg Castle, including its basement, demolished in 1968. Just for the record, the reconstruction of the Amber Room cost roughly $11 million by the time it was finished. And yes, it was partially financed by Germany in an act of contrition and goodwill. Now, that's less than 1/10 of the reported value of the original Amber Room at the time of its disappearance, meaning they must have skimped somewhere in the reconstruction. In a lovely full circle moment, though, the new Amber Room represents the same ideals of peace and allyship between Russia and Prussia, well, now Germany, as it did the first time around. Hopefully no one steals this one. Up next, we have the part of the podcast where I have to pronounce a whole lot of French names. French is not a language I have ever studied, and it is a language that mystifies me. So please bear with me. I will do my best. We're starting the next story with a woman who was pretty scandalous herself. That is the notorious Joséphine de Beauharnais, first wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, and dual empress of France and Queen of Italy for a short, bright period in the early 1800s. Born Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pragerie, she likely would have never referred to herself as Joséphine de Beauharnais. It was her first husband's last name, a man who, by all accounts, spared no love for Josephine, and lost his life to the guillotine during the French Revolution. In fact, she probably didn't go by Josephine at all until her marriage to Napoleon, instead going by Rose or Marie-Rose Tacher. She seems to have come from country gentry, the sort of family that had good social standing, perhaps some titles, but not much wealth, though Josephine herself was born on the island of Martinique in the West Indies, a veritable world away from where she would end up. Josephine did have 2 children with her first husband, with her daughter eventually going on to marry Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, which is weird, at the very least, and entirely unrelated to the story. Just wanted to throw that fact in there. There are still members of European royal families who can trace their lineage back to Josephine through her children, and they own the jewelry to prove it. Josephine herself was imprisoned during the French Revolution, spending 3 months at Carmes prison, being released only after the fall of Robespierre and the subsequent end of the Reign of Terror. The next year, she met Napoleon Bonaparte, a man 6 years her junior, and became his mistress. He seems to have been besotted with her from the get-go. Wikipedia very coyly states that Josephine was the recipient of many love letters from Napoleon, which, if you know anything about their correspondence, is a very tight-lipped understatement. No, I won't elaborate. You're going to have to look this up yourself. Engaged by January of 1796 and married by March, Napoleon's family was flabbergasted that he would choose to marry a widowed mother of 2. It's noted that Napoleon's sister and mother felt especially uncomfortable around Josephine, and that they felt clumsy and unsophisticated in her presence. Depending on how you take that, Josephine was either a haughty cool girl, or Napoleon's mom and sister had some self-esteem issues. Probably a little of both. From here, their marriage is just a series of spiteful affairs and petty grievances, with Josephine striking up an affair with a young hussar officer while Napoleon is on campaign, and Napoleon starting an affair with a woman who would become known as Napoleon's Cleopatra. All of this had happened before Napoleon was crowned emperor, so by the time they were ruling France and Italy, there was plenty of bitterness and resentment brewing between them. I think that does enough to explain some of the messiness that was the foundation of their marriage and sets the stage for what happens next. Their marriage was, understandably, very rocky throughout Napoleon's reign, and when it became clear that Josephine was not able to bear children and give him an heir, he drew up a list of other potential princesses he could knock up, sat Josephine down at the dinner table, and calmly gave her his pitiful, "I don't want to divorce you, but my family insists that I should" speech, which ended in an annulment and his insistence that Josephine keep the title of empress. It has been speculated that being slightly older, having had 2 children previously, and using dodgy contraceptives, because Josephine had a lot of lovers, according to historical record, would have made it more difficult for her to bear a child, because we do know that at one point she did have children. She had 2 of them. All right, so backtracking a little bit to right before the divorce, when Napoleon, who had yet again cheated on Josephine, gave her an emerald parure as an act of contrition. This parure, which is likely the one now known as the Norwegian Emerald Parure, is probably in the possession of the Norwegian royal family. What did I say about royal descendants? And was originally composed of a massive tiara, a necklace, and a brooch, although 2 stones were later removed from the necklace and converted to a pair of earrings. Josephine wore the parure for an official portrait, which was painted after she knew her marriage would be ending, but before the official split. It's claimed that she instructed the artist to paint her in emeralds because, and I quote, "I want them to represent the underlying freshness of my grief." Yikes. So we have a big, splashy portrait that shows us exactly what this parure looked like. It also showed everyone else what this parure looked like, and Josephine herself, not really known for being a bargain shopper, was known for her ostentatious spending habits and the piles of jewelry that Napoleon had lavished on her, both as tokens of love and apology. Shortly after this portrait was unveiled, and the divorce was finalized, Josephine's emerald parure was stolen. Ostensibly still in love with Josephine despite divorcing her, Napoleon was also desperate to control the tide of public opinion, which currently sided with Josephine, as the public disapproved of his decision to leave her. He was paranoid that his political enemies would use this as fuel and would try to pin the theft of the jewels on Napoleon himself. So, what was a paranoid, heartsick emperor to do? Well, hire a criminal to help him find the jewels, of course. Napoleon ended up procuring the help of the legendary François-Eugène Vidocq, a man who was said to be the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, as well as both Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert in Les Miserables. A notorious crook and conman of exceptional intelligence, Vidocq managed to track down Josephine's stolen emeralds in less than 3 days. After the successful retrieval of the jewels, Napoleon pardoned Vidocq for his previous crimes, and, at his request, made him a police officer. Thus, the field of criminology was born, where deductive reasoning, science, and yes, even undercover police officers were employed to help solve crimes, a shockingly modern turn for the fledgling field of police work. Over the next 2 decades, Vidocq would assemble his own specialty team of detectives, all former criminals themselves, who would collectively go on to create techniques and tools that are the foundations of police work today, such as profiling and forensic science. So, Napoleon saved face. France saw crime rates drop by up to 40% over those 2 decades, and Josephine got her jewels back. There's not really a scandal here at all, is there? Oh, yes, there is. Josephine, the self-made woman, the divorced mother of 2 who became Empress of France and Queen of Italy, was no idiot, and she was plenty petty. Given her history of media manipulation and shrewd understanding of how to leverage propaganda, it's incredibly likely that Josephine orchestrated the theft of the jewels herself, for all of the reasons Napoleon feared, that the theft would be pinned on him, and his reputation would continue to tank in the public eye. And now we're ready for the most frustrating and upsetting story in this entire series, one which immediately predates and greatly contributes to the eventual rise of Napoleon, Marie Antoinette and the affair of the diamond necklace. Born Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna in November 1755, Marie would live a rather dramatic, short, and turbulent life, punctuated by periods of vitriolic hatred leveled at her by the French, and ending so famously with her head being cut off by a guillotine. This isn't the podcast to go into the complicated and nuanced political bullshit that led to Marie Antoinette being so reviled by the French people, but we can say that she was definitely in the wrong place and the wrong role at the wrong time. History hasn't been entirely kind to her, either. The political propaganda that painted her as an irresponsible, frivolous, vain, promiscuous, and vapid queen still colors the modern perception of her. Sure, you probably know that she didn't say, "let them eat cake," but you probably don't know the sordid scam that led to her being even further disgraced in the public eye and very likely led to her eventual death. Marie came to France at the bewilderingly young and complicated age of 14, already Dauphine of France, having been married by proxy to a young Louis XVI as a means of securing an alliance between France and her home of Austria. One of the first scandals that would plague young Marie was her and Louis's inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to consummate their marriage for the first 7 years that they were wed. Public opinion about the new Dauphine and future queen was mixed from the get-go. On the one hand, she was gorgeous and had a lovely personality, and people generally enjoyed her company. On the other, a political alliance with Prussia wasn't on everyone's bingo card, while others disliked her for much pettier personal reasons. I'm thinking back to Napoleon's mother and sister disliking Josephine because she made them feel unsophisticated. Trouble started brewing in the social echelons of the court almost immediately, when Louis's aunts managed to persuade Marie to ignore Madame du Barry, the formidable mistress of the current king, Louis's grandfather, Louis XV. Madame du Barry held considerable political influence, and Marie's refusal to acknowledge her at court was threatening to jeopardize Austria's allegiance with France. Eventually, at the insistence of her mother, Marie agreed to speak to du Barry. It was just one sentence. "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." But the attempt at casual small talk was enough for du Barry to feel satisfied with the recognition. Crisis averted. As an aside, du Barry was so universally disliked by the king's family that not 2 days after his death, she was exiled to an abbey for 2.5 years, and upon her return, was not permitted to come back to Versailles. This bad blood between du Barry and Marie is an important part of the story of this scandalous necklace affair. Let's skip over some of the other stuff. Marie went on to have a bunch of children, racked up a ton of spending on beautiful jewelry, gowns, interiors, and gambling, while the country was facing a financial crisis, and managed to thoroughly piss off the majority of her subjects, who believed that the country's financial troubles were a direct result of her quote-unquote frivolous spending. I put frivolous in quotes here because, while, yes, Marie was spending inordinate amounts of money while people were starving, she was only doing that which was her duty. If she had failed to present herself as the most opulent and fashion-forward member of her incredibly fashion and image-obsessed court, the public would have torn her to shreds for it. It's long been speculated that much of Marie's incredible spending and desire to surround herself with beautiful things was the result of a deep depression, which was only ever lightened by spending time with her children. It's now 1774. Marie likes jewelry and fancy things, everyone hates her and spreads ridiculous gossip, the country is starving, and in another corner of Paris, we find two people with a completely different issue. Jewelers Charles-Auguste Baumer and Paul Bassenge are stuck with an incredibly elaborate, incredibly expensive diamond necklace that they cannot sell. Commissioned in 1772 by Louis XV for Madame du Barry, it took the jewelers several years and a shitload of money just to acquire appropriate diamonds for this spectacle. During that time, Louis XV had the audacity to die of smallpox, and du Barry was banished, leaving the necklace unclaimed and unpaid for. I really like this description of the necklace, and side note, filberts are hazelnuts. The quote goes, "A row of 17 glorious diamonds, as large almost as filberts. a 3-wreathed festoon, and pendants enough encircle it, around a very queen of diamonds. The jewelers, now stuck with the massive, sparkling liability, thought they should offer it to their new queen, a woman renowned for her taste in all things luxurious and special. In fact, Louis XVI did offer it to Marie as a gift in 1778, and here's something really telling. She turned down the gift, stating, quote, "We have more need of 74s than of necklaces. 74s are, by the way, a type of ship." This doesn't sound like the sort of thing you'd expect to hear from a dumb, frivolous queen who doesn't understand her country's hardships, does it? Because this doesn't fit the narrative created by gossip, people suspected she turned the necklace down because it was initially made for Du Barry. I say two things can be true at the same time. The jewelers, still trying to offload this massive necklace of hazelnut-sized diamonds, again tried to sell it to her in 1781, after the birth of her first son, and she once again refused. This back and forth about the necklace had to have been public knowledge because it came to the attention of the major player in this story, a con woman by the name of Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy, aka Jeanne de la Motte. She was the descendant of an out-of-wedlock son of Henry II of France, married to an officer of the gendarmes, and living off of a small pension provided to her by the king, probably as a result of being a descendant of Henry II. In 1785, Jeanne became the mistress of the Cardinal de Rohan, who was a former French ambassador to the royal court of Vienna, which Marie's mother was the strict and imposing empress of. Marie didn't like the cardinal for two reasons. One, that he had spread rumors about her behavior to her own mother, and the other that he had spoken about her mother in a way that she found offensive. Are you even your mother's daughter if you aren't simultaneously kind of terrified of her and willing to kill for her? Jeanne realized that the cardinal's desperate desire to get into the queen's good graces could provide her with major leverage in the court, which she had recently gained access to via another lover. She persuaded the cardinal that she had had an audience with the queen and had been received favorably. She kept telling the cardinal that she was making efforts to repair their relationship on his behalf, and in order to keep up this ruse, she started up a fake correspondence between the cardinal and the queen. Poor, stupid Cardinal de Rohan not only believed that these letters were real, but he managed to convince himself that the queen had fallen in love with him. He begged and begged Jeanne to set up a secret midnight rendezvous with the queen, to which Jeanne obliged. Sometime in August of 1784, the cardinal met with Marie Antoinette in the gardens of Versailles. It was dark. He offered her a rose. She promised to forget their past disagreements. It was a romantic and clandestine affair. Of course, the cardinal was not meeting the queen, but a sex worker named Nicole Leguay de Oliva, who Jeanne had hired because of her striking resemblance to Marie. Once this ploy was successful, Jeanne got even bolder. She started taking advantage of the cardinal's absolutely idiotic crush, borrowing large sums of money from him and saying they were for the queen's various charity projects. She was also openly boasting about her friendship with the queen, leading many people to assume she was telling the truth. Since everyone was trying to get their hooks into the queen, our bereft and broke jewelers, Burmer and Bassenge, took note of Jeanne's supposed friendship with her and resolved to use her to get the queen to buy that stupid fucking necklace. Jeanne, ever the demure and honest friend, first refused a commission, but eventually gave in and accepted it. Jeanne, who could not believe that such fruitful scams were just falling into her lap at this point, wrote several more letters to the cardinal, pretending to be the queen, including an order to buy the necklace. She stupidly signed them Marie Antoinette de France, but the cardinal was both equally dumb and blinded by love, so he didn't know or didn't realize that French royals only signed with their given names, which in this case would have been Maria Antonia. Having sown the seeds, Jeanne went on to tell the cardinal that the queen wanted to buy the necklace, but did not wish to be seen buying such an expensive item, one she had refused to purchase multiple times already, and wanted him to act as a secret intermediary. Cardinal Rohan renegotiated the price of the necklace with the jewelers, settling on a sum of 2 million livres, which is roughly $17.5 million in today's money, to be paid in installments. As proof of the Queen's authorization of the purchase, the Cardinal showed both jewelers her written correspondence, insisting that it was, in fact, the Queen's handwriting. Having acquired the necklace, the Cardinal brought it straight to Jean's house, where he handed it over to a man he believed was one of the Queen's valets. This man spirited the necklace away to another location where, of course, to absolutely no one's surprise, when it finally came time to start paying up, Jean once again offered the Cardinal's letters from the Queen as proof, but this wasn't enough. Boehmer, the jeweler, complained to the Queen about her failed payment, which was precisely when the entire house of cards came crashing down. The Queen, of course, had no idea what Boehmer was talking about. She insisted that she had nothing to do with this, wanted nothing to do with this necklace, wasn't friends with the Cardinal, and furthermore, had no fucking clue who this Jean de la Motte was, who claimed to be such a good friend. She had Boehmer tell her the entire story of the negotiations and promptly began having people arrested. Cardinal de Rohan was arrested and asked to explain himself to the King and Queen. He produced the fake letters, which, remember, he still fervently believed were from the Queen and were part of some bizarre secret tryst they were engaged in. This is when the fatal detail of the Queen's signature became a key detail. The King and Queen, as well as the Minister of the Court and the Keeper of the Seals, could not help but make it clear that they thought he was unbelievably stupid, that a man of noble birth and bearing, with a lifetime knowledge of the court and such an extreme hunger for status, could make such a dumb mistake. I'm sure Marie herself was absolutely mortified to find out that he believed her to be writing him such familiar, warm letters, a man she herself did not like very much at all. 3 days later, authorities arrested Jean, which, of course, gave her a nice head start to get home and destroy all of her letters and correspondence. The imposter queen, Nicole Leguay, as well as another accomplice who confessed to writing some of the letters and signing the Queen's name, were eventually arrested and confessed. After a sensational trial, Cardinal de Rohan and Nicole Leguay were acquitted. Jean de la Motte was sentenced to a public whipping, was branded with a V for volus, which means thief, on each shoulder, and was sentenced to life in a sex worker's prison. She managed to escape a year later, disguised. She then managed to make her way to London, where she wrote a tell-all memoir. I'm not even going to try the title in French, but it roughly translates to Justifying Memoirs of the Countess of Valois de la Motte, where she, you guessed it, tries to justify her actions while continuing to blame the Queen. Her story ends about as darkly as the rest of her life went. Shortly after this, she died as the result of falling from her hotel window while trying to evade debt collectors. There are reports that she was found badly mangled and already missing an eye, which has led to much speculation that there were plenty of people after her and that someone had already gotten to her and beat her as a warning. This entire sordid affair, while being orchestrated entirely by crooks and wannabes with no input from the Queen herself, still cast her in a terrible light in the public eye. By now, the French people were convinced that Marie was a promiscuous adulteress, a frivolous spendthrift, a pretty but airheaded idiot who was dragging their country's economy into the chamber pot, one silk gown and powdered wig at a time. The idea started to spread that Marie had planned the entire thing as a way to act out her hatred of the Cardinal, going to great lengths to cause him public suffering. Because the Cardinal was acquitted, it added fuel to the belief that Marie must somehow have been in the wrong. Her already tarnished reputation was continuing to blacken, and she was now thought of as being somehow simultaneously vapidly stupid and cunningly manipulative. This, of course, did not help the already fomenting unrest and resentment towards the monarchy. Salacious, degrading, and demoralizing pamphlets showing crude, pornographic drawings of the Queen in various outlandish situations and positions flooded the streets, and acted as tinder for the bonfire that was a burgeoning revolution. Marie had become a symbol of a dying empire, a representation of wealth and riches that were no longer a source of pride for the French people, but one of anguish and misery. Just 8 short years after the entire scandalous affair was brought to an end, Marie, too, met her end. During the bloody reign of terror that threw Paris into chaos during the French Revolution, and after the execution of her husband, Louis XVI, she was brought to trial on charges of orchestrating orgies at Versailles, sending millions of livres of treasury money to Austria, planning the massacre of the National Guards in 1792, and the one that probably wounded her the most, accusations of incest leveled against her by her own son, Louis Charles, who had been forced to turn against his mother at the unfathomable age of 7, not very long after her first son, Louis Joseph, had died. As you can imagine, not a single one of these charges was actually true, but Marie still met her fate at the guillotine. She is noted as having been very brave, with her last words being, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," after accidentally stepping on her executioner's foot. I think those last words tell you a lot about who Marie really was. A woman burdened with a terrible reputation, sent into a situation well beyond her control with very little power to do anything to protect herself. A woman who was turned into the opposite of a martyr, essentially a witch to be burned at the stake for the satisfaction of the people. She never said let them eat cake. She never displayed the callous disregard for the French people that was so often attributed to her. She was a devoted mother, attempted to be a good and equal partner to a husband who seemed to have a great deal of affection for her, and tried to navigate an overwhelming world where her happiness was not ever a priority. She had to work hard to carve out whatever moments of joy she could steal for herself. The Petit Trianon, her cottage retreat at Versailles, where she would disappear to cosplay a shepherdess and try to experience a crumb of normalcy, is a great testament. She is a woman who, I believe, does not deserve the reputation that she has. Well, there you have it. The conclusion to this month's deep dive on history's greatest jewelry scandals. That is probably the most writing I have done since high school, and definitely the longest episode I've recorded so far. If you would like to follow me and watch my videos on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, you can find me at moonhoney.jewelry on any of those. If you'd like to see my goldsmithing work and the jewelry that I make, much of which is inspired by ancient and historical jewelry, you can head over to shopmoonhoney.com. If you would like to join me on Patreon, you can come over to patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories, where if you join at the $5 a month tier, you will get a bonus episode each month, as well as the opportunity to vote in polls to determine future topics for video episodes and deep dives. If you want some merch, I'm really slacking on adding new designs, but they will be up soon, I promise. You can find that at merch.shopmoonhoney.com. And as always, if you liked this episode, please leave me a rating and review. And Spotify now has comments, which is very fun. You can leave a comment too. I love to hear from you guys when you enjoy the episodes. If you did not enjoy it, you can keep it to yourself. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you in a couple weeks with a brand new deep dive topic and more ancient history jewelry stories.